Good morning, everyone. My name is Stacey Halligan, and I'm the Community Prison Links Worker with Fusion CPL. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the launch of the evaluation report of the Reach Out programme pilot. Unfortunately, during the live webinar yesterday, we had a technical difficulty, and the first portion of the webinar, which featured an introduction from our MC, Pat Montague, and a presentation from Manager Kathy Watts, did not record. Therefore, we've decided to record that first part. Everything else you see was recorded live on the day. Soon you will hear from Kathy Watts, Manager of Fusion CPL, who will discuss the work of Fusion CPL in Irish prisons and give an introduction to Reach Out. Directly after Kathy's presentation, you'll see a video entitled The Reach Out Programme in the Participants' Own Words.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending this very important day, the Reach Out programme launch for the Fusion CPL project. Just to give you some background on Fusion, Fusion CPL was set up in 2013 by the Ballyfermot Drug and Alcohol Task Force to support individuals living in the community with addiction issues. We work in the Ballyfermot, Cherry Orchard, Palmerstown and Chapel Lizard area. Our project is funded through the Department of Social Protection, the HSE and the Probation Service. The work we do on site, we do key working, counselling, group work, holistic therapies and rehabilitative community employment placements. The aim of our community prison link worker is to support the individual while in prison, encouraging them to make the best use of their sentence while addressing their addiction issues, and to encourage them to work towards a plan of action on their release, to prevent reverting to a cycle of drug use and reoffending, and often through alienation from their families or partners, homelessness. Stacey Halligan, our community prison link worker, is employed with Fusion since 2012. Through her work and interactions with the clients, she noticed the majority of them were extremely concerned about their family relationships, especially their children and partners. Following discussion, we came up with the idea of parenting from the inside and how this could be done in conjunction with the family on the outside. Pre-COVID, we completed a funding proposal and successfully received funding through the Ballyfermot Drug and Alcohol Task Force and the HSE. We then commissioned Arteries to design and facilitate the programme, and on its completion to carry out the research. Stacey identified the progression unit of Mountjoy campus as the ideal location to pilot the programme. Following a series of meetings with prison staff and Governor Walsh, he then gave permission and an undertaking to support the delivery of the programme within the progression unit. The Reach Out programme was designed in two sections. Prison staff and community workers were identified to be trained up as mentors using the MAP mentoring skills. The mentors would support participants, known as the mentees, throughout the programme. All mentees recruited were serving their sentence in the progression unit. The programme was delivered in group setting, 12 group sessions in total. Each mentee received one-to-one weekly mentoring sessions with their mentor during the programme. In addition, 2 special family day visits took place for the mentees and their families. Visits were extended, additional ties and lunch were provided. One of the events took place over the Christmas period with Santa visiting the children. These family visits were extremely relaxed, making the visiting experience more enjoyable for all involved. The contents of the Reach Out programme. It consists of 5 interlinked components. Child parent interest surveys. The purpose of the surveys is to garner information from both parent and child about their everyday activities, their likes, their dislikes, their hopes, their dreams, and their expectations. This process creates a shared knowledge to enable both prisoner and the child to contextualize and inform the topic of their communication. The Child Development Module. This module examines the 3 core developmental stages that children progress through from the ages of 3 to 12 years. The modules include information on the behaviours that accompany these developmental stages and the thought processes and the activities children routinely engage in throughout these stages. The Enhanced Communication module covers problem solving, creative thinking, social skills, management of emotions, negotiation skills, values enhancement, and critical reasoning. The Mentoring module. Mentors are trained in mediation and goal orientation planning strategies, crisis management, family problem solving, and perspective-based communication practice. Mentors are provided with monthly supervision by trained MAP mentors. The tip sheets. The tip sheets targets problems in communications and relationships that prisoners routinely face. These tip sheets were developed in interaction with the mentees and enabled mentees to problem solve and practice the key skills required to deal with the emergencies of unexpected family situations or issues or personal crisis in relation to the family communication. These tip sheets were incorporated into manuals.
It's a programme to teach you to be a solid part of a little bleeding person's life, because that's what he is, you know.
The tips like reading the book and learning what stages he's at in his own development. When you just get on the phone and he's not out playing, they're just non-stop. Like the phone stops, we don't even finish the conversation and the phone just cuts. Whereas it used to be, yeah, like, oh, okay, right, love you, ma's looking for you.
I thought twice about the way I approach things with the kids and the visits and the phone stuff like that.
So what benefits did you find from the mentoring process?
Advice, commitment, just all around anything I needed. Approachable in terms of the engagement with my mother. That was just out of this world, to be honest with you. It was the first time I'd experienced in prison staff and families working together, so it was brilliant.
It taught me that I have a lot more to give to people than I thought I did.
Yeah, I did read them with my older sister, to be honest with you, because she has younger children as well. It wasn't just helping me and my children, it was helping her. So the books came in handy.
They seem to have a much better rapport with one another and share an awful lot more. The kids are sharing loads with him about like school and friends. They seem to have a really good relationship.
So would you recommend this process to others?
To every person that ever comes through the prison gates, definitely if they have children, to do it, and if grandparents and family can get involved, it's fantastic. I think that it done for us was it made them family again. It wasn't just that they had to go to that prison to see their dad, it became enjoyable.
Sean is Deputy CEO of Archways, which is an organisation that provides support to families and children. Describes itself as a centre of excellence, Sean. So no doubt, I think the work that you did reflects that and reflects that approach to your work. Sean, as you can gather, then has a particular focus on psychology in terms of his own academic background, but also his work. And that's very much reflected then in the development of the programme, which Sean was involved through Archways in developing the programme, but also in conducting the evaluation. And I think certainly having looked at the report myself, I think that there's a lot of certainly very profound insights from the programme, but also Sean's presentation of it. So Sean, over to you. to present the findings of the evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So, thank you. My name is Sean McDonald, as Pat said, and I'm the Deputy CEO of Archways. And as Pat said, Archways is an organisation which is philanthropically and governmentally funded, and our primary remit is to introduce evidence-based solutions for parents, children, and families who are experiencing social, emotional, and behavioural difficulty. And we have introduced a number of and mainstreamed a number of therapeutic interventions for families, which are now made available throughout various counties throughout the country. But I'm here today to talk about the Reach Out programme, and specifically the development of the Reach Out programme and the research evaluations. So when Fusion CPL came to visit us and asked us if we would be interested in developing a parenting intervention, they came to us and they had some very definite objectives. They wanted a parenting intervention which would re-establish and support attachment between the prisoner and their families. They wanted that process and program to enable parents to parent from inside the prison, outside to their families in the community. And they also wanted a program which would input a sense of collaboration and cohesion within the family unit, which would promote reintegration and reduce offending upon the prisoner's release. And to be honest, when they came to us with that list of objectives, we were somewhat confused. They're very big objectives, very large. And we wondered if any parenting intervention could manage to achieve those goals. But actually, the power of families to influence prisoner outcomes is significantly underestimated, and more underestimated in this jurisdiction than in any other. So why would you need parenting programs within a prison setting? Well, the profile of prisoners in Irish prisons is somewhat unique, and that profile isn't really the best profile for supporting the continuance and maintenance of family units, once a prisoner has entered the prison system itself. Over half of all those incarcerated in Irish prisons are parents of minor children. More than 1/3 of prisoners are incarcerated during the formative years of their children's development. And in a recent survey, almost half of all those who are currently incarcerated felt they had disengaged from the parenting role within 6 months of their actual sentence. And for high tariff prisoners, those who are serving longer prison sentences, if they lose touch with the family within the first 3 years of sentence, then that connection is lost, and very often it's irretrievable. And actually, this has profound effects, both for the prisoner in terms of their mental health and sense of engagement, but also for the child. So, interestingly, the effect on children of having a parent incarcerated seems to happen quite, quickly. There's an immediate effect post-arrest and a further deepening of that effect post-conviction. And the difficulties that children experience seem to be global in nature. So they experience mental health difficulties in behavior and social behavior. They have difficulty regulating their emotional content. And you see quite quickly a dip in terms of educational attainment. They also experience high levels of social stigma from having a parent who's incarcerated. And they experience higher levels of emotional trauma than peers. And these difficulties, when taken together, give rise to a series of both overt and covert presentations. So the overt presentations would be externalizing behaviors, and the covert presentation would be things like anxiety, early onset depression, and dysthymia. And these children, children of those parents who are incarcerated, experience these conditionalities to a much greater extent than their peers. So, why support parent engagement in a prison? Well, parent programs can produce multiple benefits. Benefits for the child, benefits for the parent, and actually benefits for the prison. But it's also a right for the prisoner. And when we were talking to Fusion, we recognized that actually introducing a successful parent intervention would also be an opportunity for the community itself. as I said earlier, family is perhaps the most underestimated influence or factor in terms of criminal desistance and reoffending. It has the power to inculcate desistance and actively interrupt the process of recidivism. It also reduces offending by 20 to 30% and does seem to promote successful reintegration for returning prisoners. So prisoners who are returning to a stable family unit, who have maintained contact with their families, are 30 to 40% less likely to engage in criminal activity upon release than those who are not, who do not have a family or have a family which is not supportive and, of them upon their release. But in terms of children themselves, continued contact between incarcerated prisoners and their children prevents breach of trust, which we now know is perhaps the primary cornerstone of trauma. These children experience significant levels of trauma if contact is lost, but actually contact acts as a protective factor for development of trauma, and actually for partners to informed engagement in family life by partners who are in prison produces partner stress by some 60 to 80%. So overall, sorry, my slides seem to have got themselves slightly mixed up. So in prison, all prisoners. Yeah. So the difficulty with.
Just take a minute there, Sean.
Yeah, I just need to kind of look at my slides. They seem to have jumbled themselves up. Okay. From our point of view, it seemed fairly early on that there seemed to be benefits to running parenting interventions within the prison system itself. And I talked about some of the benefits and how these benefits apply to the parents, to the family, and to the child. But we were very much aware that the type of parenting programs that were operating in prisons needed to be somewhat looked at in terms of their fit for purpose, whether they were fit for purpose. And so what we decided to do was we would carry out a number of extensive studies with prisoners before we would begin the development of the program. And we found some quite interesting kind of effects. Pre-sentence, when we talked to prisoners, their knowledge of children, their interests, their dreams, their struggles, their educational attainment was all quite extensive. They had detailed and elaborated knowledge of their children before they went into prison, and they seemed to spend a considerable period of time engaged with them. Post-sentence, the knowledge that they had was quite topic specific and reductive. They had very little knowledge of the day-to-day activities of their children, very little knowledge of their successes, very little knowledge of their difficulties. And the internal world of the child also seemed to be lost to them. There was also a really interesting effect in terms of the partners. Partners were extremely reluctant to share parenting issues with prisoners. Actually, when we discussed this with the partners, they said that prison itself was an extremely stressful environment, that the partners who were in prison were under a great deal of stress. They were often anxious and concerned about what was happening outside with them. And so they didn't want to add to that burden by telling them if there was concerns around either the health or the behavior of their children. And strangely, and in a circular kind of way, the prisoners themselves were extraordinarily reluctant to offer parenting advice. I spoke to 12 prisoners around the idea of, offering advice to their children. And all of them said they didn't feel entitled to do that because they recognized that their behavior, the prison sentence itself, which followed, placed a considerable burden not simply on their partners, but also placed a considerable burden on the children and their development. And actually, this accounted for one of the really interesting features of interviewing these men. Often these men would say that they would tell their children that they weren't in prison, that they were working in a factory or they were going away for periods of time, but they certainly didn't want to discuss working in prison. And initially, when I read the research and when spoke to the men. Myself, I was of the opinion that perhaps this was that they didn't want to accept responsibility for being in prison. But actually, the men themselves did not want to talk about prison and the fact that they were in prison, because they felt it would further, it would hurt the child emotionally, hurt the child cognitively, and hurt the child in terms of their behavior going forward. And of all of the participants that we interviewed, it was extraordinary that most of them admitted that they felt ill-prepared and uncertain as how best to engage with their children in terms of the when they were serving a sentence. This was really kind of interesting because there was a kind of stasis effect for the children. It was almost as though the children had frozen in time in terms of the parents. So they were really good at engaging with the child at the level of a 6-year-old, but actually when the child, because of the time had passed when they were in prison, when the child was 11 or 12, they simply didn't know what to talk to the child about, how to engage with the child, and how to share confidences with the child in a way which is going to assist their development. So, parenting programs within prisons are hugely popular. They're low cost, they promote well-being, they certainly promote prisoner mental health and families' mental health. And actually, there's been a series of studies done which suggest that if prisons introduce parenting programs as part of their everyday service, the environment is more amenable and more productive for both prison officers and prison staff. So they work. And they work really well, and they have been doing that since the early 80s when they were first introduced. But it is important to note that programs within prison are between 40 and 60% less. Parenting programs within prison are between 40 to 60% less than they are if they're introduced in clinic and community settings. And the reason for that is really kind of straightforward. When you're running a parenting intervention in a clinic or community, you gather together a group of parents, you then introduce some strategies, and you get the group to work collectively to introduce those strategies. They bring them home, they practice and work with the child, and over time, the skills are embedded. The opportunity to practice is fundamental for any successful parenting intervention. The absence of practice opportunities has been shown to limit change in a variety of studies conducted both here at home in our own studies, but also abroad. And unfortunately, the design of prison negates the idea of continuous application of parental strategies. Reductive visitation time, developmentally inappropriate visitation rooms, the lack of family rooms and family space. So prisoners actually can learn strategies and skills, but if they don't have the opportunity to take those skills, spend time with the child and practice them, neither child nor parent is going to achieve the same level of success with a parenting program that they would if they were doing that program outside. That is not to say that they don't work, they just work less well. So given that, we recognize that perhaps we would need to develop a program which took account of the research findings that we had found in our interviews with the prisoners. So we had to decide on a program that, instead of focusing on strategies, would focus on parental insight and knowledge. And that was kind of a tough ask, because it was easy enough for us to fall back on standard parenting programs. We'd run a number of parenting programs in Archways, which had been randomly evaluated, random control evaluations, and had worked remarkably well. But we were very conscious of what we could do, the time that was being made available to us in the prison, and the time that the prisoners had in terms of contact time directly with either their partner or their child. So we decided that we would go for the building insight and knowledge strategy. And to do that, and Kathy's already talked about this, we developed a series of interactive modules. The first module we developed was a developmental module and parent mentoring, to essentially to identify what the child could, should, and would be able to do. Often the prisoners and the participants in this program, they either pitched their content knowledge at the child either too high or too low. And unfortunately, this placed the child in a position of real difficulty. They didn't know how exactly to react to the child. So first, we built developmental modules to enable the participants and the prisoners to identify exactly what the child was capable of doing. And they took to that really, really well. Actually, this was the first set of modules we introduced, and I was a little bit cautious and careful around I was uncertain as to whether or not they would take this kind of information on board, because they would take these developmental modules, bring them back to the cell, spend time kind of examining them, and then we would meet again, and they would tell us about, you know, how best they wanted to introduce them with their child. We also introduced shared interest surveys, which were done with the parent and with their child, and essentially that gave us an idea, of the who, why, and what of the participants and the child, and actually it created a kind of conversational platform for the prisoner and the child to kind of engage in. So each time a prisoner met their child, they would talk about two of the subject items on the shared interest survey, which meant that they had to go away the week before and spend time focusing on and learning knowledge about what that children's interest was, which was fascinating because two of the children were deeply involved in art, and both of their parents, who were prisoners, had absolutely no interest in art at all. And yet by the end of this process, they were talking about Van Gogh and how best to use light colors and refraction. And we also got both partner and prisoner to develop historical narratives. So narratives about what their childhood had been like, what their school experience had been like, narratives about what they were like when they were teenagers, narratives about how they met their partners. And we gave these narratives to the children, and actually this created an extensive bond between the child and the parent and the partner outside, which happened really, really quickly, and which was fairly easy to kind of research and engage. Actually, child content knowledge of both partners increased by 60 to 70%, largely, I think, as a consequence of the historical narratives. We had to be very careful in the construction of historical narratives. First, the narratives had to be true, and second, the narratives had to be relevant to the developmental stage of the child. So obviously, when you're running an evaluation process, you have to develop baselines, and this is what we did in this case. So prior to the program itself, all of the prisoners admitted that they had limited involvement in the day-to-day parenting of their child, and this was a view which is very much confirmed by their partners. It's not that they didn't, it's not that they didn't want to be involved with their parent. As I said earlier, they felt sometimes that they just simply weren't entitled to offer an opinion. All of the participants agreed they worried about the absence of how a male figure would affect their child. And interestingly, of the group that we worked with, several of them had asked siblings, male siblings, to regularly visit the child so that that male presence would be available to their child. And I think that when you take into account that level of thought, it does show you the extent to which these men were extraordinarily conscious of what their absence had created. And they also worried that their children would experience prejudice and stigmatization. And like I said earlier, one of the things that struck me was this idea that they simply wouldn't say, that they were in prison or why they were in prison. And largely that was because they didn't want to have their child further exposed to the levels of prejudice and stigmatization, which incarcerated children of incarcerated prisoners experience. Frankly, if these children were if they were going to be dealt with in the same way as a consequence of their race, their color, or their creed, then serious steps will be taken to protect these children, because there is significant levels of both prejudice and stigmatization that these children experience, and they know it, and they communicate it, and they feel it. And all of the participants also worried very much that their children might get drawn into cycles of criminality. These participants and prisoners were aware that their own behavior did make that process somewhat more likely than the norm. But they were also aware that while they were in prison, that the world outside had changed significantly. These were all men who'd been in prison for significant periods of time, and they were looking out and seeing a world which, frankly, many of them didn't recognize. And they could, like we could, see the unnecessary threat that children are sometimes exposed to. So actually, in many ways, these parents were experiencing levels of difficulty that we would experience, but to a much more elevated rate. So post-program, what did we find? Well, obviously post-program, you have to find really good outcomes. And in this case, the outcomes were fairly certain. We wanted these parents to be more engaged with their children, and that turned out to be the case. Prisoners were much more informed as to their children's activities, their interests, and their educational outcomes. Actually, one or two prisoners began to actually take on educational courses and learn some of the topic areas that their children were studying, which I thought was really, really quite fascinating. It was, again, it wasn't simply a question of doing an educational task, it was doing an educational task that the child was also doing and building that relationship as a consequence. They were much more involved in terms of collaborative parenting, and we used the collaborative parenting scale to track that change, and the change that we found was between 60 and 70%. And all of the participants increased their level of direct communication with their child. That was something that we had to do through observation, and it was really interesting to see how it worked. So when we first went in and met with the prisoners during visitation, they would spend 60% of that time, maybe more, 80% of that time, talking directly to their partner. And then the conversational asides they would have with the children. But actually in communication with the prisoners and with our partners, we agreed that what they would do is they would spend at least 40 to 50% of each visitation speaking about the child and speaking about something on the child interest surveys. And at first we expected a real resistance from the prisoners with this, but actually with the help of the partners, they took to it really, really quickly. So when we were watching prisoners partake in visitation, what you saw wasn't simply communication between adults, but far more communication with the child and about the child. And I think that made the children feel extremely secure in what is an insecure environment. There was also increased levels of parenting communication with partners. We asked specifically that if the child was experiencing any difficulties, that the partner communicate that with the child, and our mentors would be available to meet with the prisoners if that information caused any kind of concern. Stacey will be aware of that and knows how that kind of process worked. And often that did prove to be the case. If a partner on the outside was worried about their child, they would now begin to talk with their partner inside. And what happened was then, a process of kind of collaborative problem solving took place, and the lines of communication were kept much clearer as a consequence of that. We did have to work with prisoners on 2 occasions because the topic that was brought up by the partner obviously was problematic, and the prisoner felt somewhat powerless to input into that. But when we explained that actually it's his ideas and his presence that's important, he took to it really well. They also increased the number of direct phone calls to their children. So before we started this kind of process, prisoners spent most of their phone calls with the partners, and again, with the partner's consent and with the partner's support, they broke that down so that 50% of all of their phone calls would be made with the children themselves. And in partner surveys, we found that not only did they feel there were greater levels of parental engagement, what they call dad engagement, there was also greater involvement and improved decision making by the incarcerated parent post program. So the lived experience of these participants and prisoners, I'd have to say that all of the participants were really engaged in the process pretty much from the get-go. As Kathy explained, we did a significant amount of pre-work in the development of the program, and a significant amount of work in terms of the selection criteria. They were at all times open, honest, and as the process went on, reflective. And I think this is kind of really important because this was a process that gave rise to considerable internal conflict. And, whenever you're running a program, you have this kind of sensation when you're going in and you're sitting in a room and you're waiting for people to come in, and you're wondering, okay, what are they going to bring you this day? But actually, on several occasions, it was quite emotional for the participants. And the reason for that was that they began to recognize that their behavior and the consequences of their behavior had placed a real burden on the child and a real burden on their partners. And that knowledge obviously created a considerable amount of guilt, which had to be carefully moderated and mediated. Also, the higher level of connectivity with the children, the more time they spent with their kids, and that building of attachment had a kind of peculiar effect. It became an emotionally painful process for these prisoners. So limitations, they noticed that visitation times were way too short for them. They were halfway through an activity that was designed to build a relationship between the parent and child, and the visitation would have to end. And that became a significant stimulus for the prisoners in terms of their desire to have not only longer visitation, but more complete visitation. So, family days, Zoom contacts, and I'll talk about that a little later on. But in terms of the guilt that they felt, and in terms of the emotional pain and anxiety that they felt, by week 5, 6, 7, and 8, they were coming to terms with that. And actually, they stated that quite clearly. These were issues that they were having to deal with. And we had to modify some of the program content to recognize and reflect the emotional content of the prisoners themselves. And actually, they began towards the end of their program to provide insight and guidance as to how best they think the program could be developed going forward for other prisoners that they knew within the prison system itself. And they became real advocates for the program going forward. So I would often walk into the prison with Stacey, and we would be getting things ready, and we would see prisoners walking around with the tip sheets. Not the prisoners we were dealing with, but other prisoners that we were dealing with, that the prisoners had contact and connection with. And that was really, from the point of view of a program developer, it was really nice to see, but it was also surprising that you would have prisoners on a balcony or on a landing talking about parenting while you're walking in to develop a parenting intervention. So going forward, I'm not sure what fell there, but it was very loud. I wanted to kind of talk about what we would like to see happen. And before I did that, I wanted to kind of emphasize, we're not suggesting that family communication programs should replace parenting programs. What we're suggesting is that these processes are complementary, and that any parenting program going forward would be more productive if this process was introduced in advance of that. And so for us, we believe that this process is complementary to parent interventions in a prison setting, and that parent interventions within a prison setting have benefits for the family, for the child, for the prisoner, and actually for the prison itself. We conducted this process pre-COVID, which seems an inordinate length of time ago. And I kind of wanted to emphasize just how connected and committed these people were to the program. The prisoners came forward with a number of recommendations that they would like to see going forward. So obviously extended visitation and family days were part of that kind of process. But they also suggested that perhaps Zoom meetings with their families could be conducted once a day. So once an evening they would meet in Zoom and see their child face to face, and that would build a relationship both for them, but also normalize the relationship for their children. Now, many of these things post-COVID have actually been implemented by the prison, by Menchai itself. But it's important to note that these men came up with these ideas prior to the introduction of Zoom. So these were pre-Zoom ideas, which seems a long time ago. So what we would like to do is we would like to kind of work with prisoners going forward. But we'd also like to work with prisoners in a way that isn't simply about delivering a program, but working with prisoners to ensure the program is fit for purpose within a prison setting. Obviously, this was a small study, and we'd like to roll out the program and evaluate it in a more complete and probably more complicated and complex kind of way. And we would like to use that program and introduce the program in both male and female prisoners, and compare the effect of this program on males and the effect of this program on females. And also, and this is kind of one of the key learning points of our evaluation, we would like to kind of do some parental work and group work with partners and the husbands who are in prison or wives who are in prison simultaneously, because often there was a slight lag in knowledge content between the parent who was in prison and the partner who was at home, and that often led to disagreements or misunderstandings between the prisoner and their partners. And sometimes we have to spend 10 minutes, of our mentoring process kind of addressing those kind of issues. And I think that could quite easily be resolved by having this kind of simultaneous delivery. And actually, all of the partners that we were involved in, and 10 of the partners who did not make it onto the program, felt that would also be a really good idea. I'm coming to the last slide, which you can hear, people breathing and an expectation of finishing. I have to say, for me, I've been involved in a number of large-scale studies: children with ADHD, children with autism, children with behavioral regulation difficulties, and and in all cases, they've been fascinating to work with the families who have these children with these conditionalities. So I very much expected that this would be a similar process for me going into this environment, but it was very much a learning experience for me. Everything from the logistics of getting into the prison to the logistics of working with the prisoners and their partners and at times their children was difficult but extremely rewarding. I grew to kind of like the participants in this kind of program. I mean, I brought my own prejudice into this process. It's kind of entirely it's kind of important that's recognized. We all carry with us some idea of what these men are and you know what it is that they have done, but actually they're serving a sentence, and we don't need to double down on that, and we certainly don't need to double down on that in terms of their children. And so by the end of this process, what I saw was a group of men who were somewhat lost in terms of their engagement with their child, who were working hard to retrieve that. And I took that on its merits and developed what I consider to be useful working relationships with them. I'd also have to say that in terms of the prison staff and the warders, they made us extraordinarily welcome right from the beginning and facilitated the process very much. I mean, I would turn up at the gates of the prison sometimes, 20 minutes before I was due to deliver the program. Stacey would be losing the plot because I was somewhat late. And there is a line process, to get into prison. But the prison staff always ensured I was brought to the room with the necessary time to calm myself down and get my work ready. And the support of the governor throughout this process has been remarkable, actually. I think he's a man who sees the benefits of family engagement within a prison setting, and I think he's willing to take risks to do that. Very early on, a prisoner told me that parenting involvement is not a privilege, it's a right. And when he told me that, I sort of dismissed it. I kind of thought that if it is a privilege, you're not making the best use of it. But at the end of this process, having seen the level of work that people have put in, that the prisoners have put in, I have to say, if parents outside of the prison did the same level of work with the same level of care, children in our communities would be healthy, happier, and more well balanced. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation. I really apologize for the difficulty with the slides. Inevitably, you said to yourself there will be no difficulty with slides, and inevitably there's difficulty with slides. So listen, thank you very much, and I hope that was of interest to note.
Thanks, Sean. I think, and just a comment has come through there about how good the presentation was. And I think, Sean, was very obvious listening to you and indeed even reading the stuff, and my engagement with you over recent weeks is just the incredible passion and enthusiasm that you have for this particular work and this project, and that really comes across. So thank you for that, as well as obviously the insight and perspective that you bring as well. I'm struck by something, and this was a quote before we get on to the video, but I just thought I'd share with everybody a quote that Stacey sent me on from one of the participants in the program. And I think this really captures in a very concrete way the benefits of the program. And basically the person said, look, this program didn't give me a reason to live. It taught me how to live with reason. And I think that really sort of captures it, that, it's providing people with the tools and the equipment and the understanding and the perspective to become better at something. And I think it's one of the things that even Sean, listening to, I've a lot of perspective myself as a parent. Thankfully, mine are sort of between 31 and 24. But I have to say, I've learned a lot from it. But you mentioned the governor, and I think this then segues just to the point, if we can, Sean, if you stop sharing your screen there, and now we can go to Stacey, would you run now? This is just an interview that we did with the governor, with Governor Donecha Walsh, apologies. And Donecha As Sean said, it was a great supporter of the programme, and that's very evident and very obvious from this particular interview. So let's roll it there, please, Stacey. So just bear with us and we'll get to the right point. Now, the programme itself, obviously you're familiar with the Reach Out programme. Yeah. From your perspective as Governor, what are the benefits that you have seen from the programme, I suppose, for the prisoners involved in the programme?
It has been very positive for the prisoners. Look, a lot of the prisoners who took part in the programme had worries about their children on the outside, that they might follow the same path as them, and they wanted to I suppose, give that information to get that information to them, that prison is not a place for to be, and that if they could communicate in a way that would get through to them in relation to it. So that's why it was important that the families of the prisoners were doing a similar course in the community, yeah. And those guys were doing it within the prison.
Yeah.
So there was an experience on both sides. The Fusion program, Reach Out, brought that it brought a bit of normality, and it also asked hard questions of the prisoners to say, you know, you're in prison. You need to maintain family links. They're vital. Your family out there are actually victims themselves because they've lost their father, they've lost their brother, they've lost their husband, whatever the case may be, because they're in prison. So there's a lot of hurt with them. So both the understanding for the prisoner was that his family felt some level of pain by his imprisonment, and also that the family shared the pain that the prisoner was feeling while being in custody. This all happened pre-pandemic,
yeah.
And we were I suppose, setting up a family visiting area within the progression unit where the lads completed the programme were accommodated. And it gave us, as managers, the idea of what best suited, what does a guy and a family need to get the maximum out of their visit. Guys and their families got benefit out of coming up to Mountjoy to visit. Absolutely. Like we introduced colouring books, markers, and so the whole family became more important to the guys, and they felt that by maintaining those families will actually help them through their sentence, knowing that there's loved ones waiting for them. And it also, amazingly enough, guys got involved in positive things, in more getting education, getting skills, so that when they leave prison, that they will have a structure and they might get further education, employment.
One of the things that came up in the report was the idea of family days. There were sort of requests for maybe more frequent phone calls, possibly phone calls over Skype or online, so that people can see each other. Yeah. Do you think are those things possible? Would you be supportive of those developments?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the benefits of the video link visit is, as lads would tell me, that they can see the house that they came from. They can see the dog. They can see the artwork on the fridge that their kids are after doing in the school that day. So that benefits it. Yeah. But I firmly believe there's no replacement for actually the physical talking, and having an environment, create an environment in a visiting area that meets that. And that's what the progression unit is aiming towards. And across the prison estate, we had a family links evaluation in 2017. There's a report there, and most of the prisons are working towards those recommendations. But however, like everything else, things stalled during because of the pandemic. Now that we're in the unwinding process, prisons are now taking those recommendations and working towards.
Is it something that you think should be mainstreamed throughout the prison service, this programme, do you think is it something that would be beneficial if it went beyond simply just the pilot stage?
This programme would fit lovely in to that family links person to, I suppose, explore and, you know, roll out into the other different prisons. I've seen the benefit of it in the progression unit. It has made, I suppose, just staff and myself to rethink, you know, the importance of maintaining relationships with families while their lads are in custody. So, there's a little bit of work to do around that. There's no doubt about it. But I could see if this programme was rolled out and got the green light from IPSHQ, I'd see it fitting in lovely to every prison, because the benefits are enormous. Because guys change their attitudes towards what they want to do in prison. It also changes their attitudes towards their family. Yeah. How important and understanding that the family actually suffers as well. It's not all about me. I'm in jail. I'm the victim. I'm feeling sorry for themselves. But actually, there's people out there that are victims themselves because they've lost a loved one as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So, folks, I'm going to just quickly call on Kathy to wrap up the presentation piece, and then we're going to open up to questions from those of you online. And if coming back to questions, what we'd like for you to do is use the chat function, please, to put your questions into the chat function, and I will take them and then put to our panelists. And the reason I'm saying that now is just give you a chance maybe to put together some questions while Kathy is speaking. So Kathy, you're just going to look at the, I suppose, what happens next as the introductory slide there. And I suppose it's how do we build on the experience of the Reach Out programme and improve things for prisoners, their families, and indeed the wider community.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. I think this morning's brief lunch has given a flavour of what the Reach Out programme is and what it can achieve. In order to do that, funding would be extremely available. We have seen, which has been backed up by the comments here this morning, the programme has been proven to work, and it is important that funding will be made available to enable us to bring it into all prisons, to benefit the prisoners and their children, their families and the wider community. I do feel with funding, we will be able to train up mentors. There'll be full training and support available for mentors, which will enable them to support the prisoners to complete the programme. And then down the road, I would hope that this programme could become peer-led with a lot of support. So I suppose the wish list would be that relevant agencies take note of the programme and funding continues to enable us to carry out that.
Thanks, Kathy. And now we have just time for questions, and haven't received, well, actually we do have a question here from Dahi Doolan, and Dahi and I know each other. So thanks, Dahi, for your kind comments on the launch and the contents of it. And Dahi's question is how can we ensure this pilot is mainstreamed and continues to benefit families and communities and in Ballyfermot and beyond? So let's not answer that yet, because I think I want to go into some other questions as well. So we've 3 questions now, and I want to put the 3 of them to you. So we'll take them as a grouping, as a cluster of questions. A question from Shauna Kurskadden, who's asking, is this programme going to be linked with Wheatfield Prison? And also then how would people be able to make a referral to the program to get people onto the program? And so they're the two questions that have come in. And I'm going to add a question, if you don't mind, as well, which is for the three of you that have been involved in it, what was the single biggest, I suppose, surprise to you that emerged from the program? What was it that came out of it? And it could be even just, you know, something fairly simple or whatever. What was the thing that surprised you most out of the experience that you weren't expecting? So maybe could we turn to Stacey first on in relation to the three questions, and then I'll go to the other two, because the other two have been in a bit, and Stacey, you haven't had much of a chance, so I want to give you the first shot at dealing with those three questions.
Thank you, Pat. I guess, how can we ensure that it's mainstreamed? We need to secure continued funding so that we can roll it out across all the prison estate and open it out to all prisoners and their families. Yes, we would love it to be linked with Wheatfield Prison, and actually before the pandemic we did have some conversations with the governor in Wheatfield, but then obviously everything came to a stop for the last 2 years. And referral wise, we've to tease stuff out going forward, but I know for the pilot we took referrals from ISM officers and chaplains, but I'm sure that if it is a need, we could look about how we could accept referrals from the community. And the single biggest thing for me, I suppose it's not really answering your question, but it kind of is. I suppose the benefit of the timing of it. We had just finished whenever everything went into lockdown, and I got letters from a few of the participants to say that the skills that they had picked up, specifically the enhanced communication skills, had really stood to them for their communication during the pandemic, when they were relying on limited visits and, you know, a few phone calls. So I think that was a huge benefit for me, that it had an impact probably at the worst time of everyone's life. Yeah.
Thanks, Stacey, for that. And I might do, before getting into the other questions, I might turn, Sean, to you. Let's start with the last question first, so we just sort of, in a sense, build on what Stacey was saying. What was the thing that surprised you most? What was the thing that you weren't expecting and that you observed or experienced through the program?
I think I wasn't expecting the honesty of the prisoners, to be perfectly honest, and how open they were to discussing, you know, what had happened to them and what brought them to the prison. And also how quickly they took to the material and adapted their behaviors. It wasn't as though that wasn't challenging at times. In fact, the quote you made was came when I was having a discussion with a prisoner around, you know, how to communicate information to his partner in a way that was amenable and respectful. So it wasn't as though there weren't challenges, but they took to it really well and adapted their behavior. The other thing was just how protective they were of each other, partner to prisoner, prisoner to partner, both partners to child. It really, over the course of the 12 or 14 weeks that we were running this type of process, it really became clear, and we could see the elevated levels of attachment that were developing as the weeks went on. And I think how protective they became of that change over time, for me, was fascinating to watch.
So turning to the other two questions, Sean, which is then about the mainstreaming, and then also too about potential for something like Wheatfield to get involved.
Well, in terms of mainstreaming, as I mentioned earlier, for me, I see this process as being complementary to general parenting interventions within prisons. In fact, I think it's essential if those interventions are to work successfully. So I think for me, you know, getting this process, you know, mainstreamed in the prison environment is very much about, you know, linking it into that kind of family and parental kind situation. In terms of Wefield, we did have initial discussions with Wefield, and they seemed very interested about it. But this was pre-COVID, and then COVID came about and stopped us in our tracks. But yeah, we would very much like to introduce this program in Wefield. I think it's the perfect environment for doing that. And actually, I think we'll mainstream this program by building up more research as to how well it operates within the prison environment and the change effects it can bring about.
Thanks very much. Kathy, do you want to sort of come in on those questions?
Yeah, I suppose I just want to highlight the reason it was such a small study too. When you're running programs of this nature, if you're running them in the community, the logistics in the planning and getting people there and getting facilitators to facilitate is a lot easier than it would be in the prison setting. When you're doing groups, particularly from outside onto the inside, there's a lot more planning, there's a lot more logistics involved, and making sure there's prison staff around and getting all the prisoners into one room at one time. Believe it or not, prisons is actually a very busy environment. Prisoners don't sit around all day doing nothing. They all go to different classes and they all have different places to be. So the whole logistics and the security and getting the planning and getting us in, getting rooms set up takes quite a lot of work. So ideally, when we set up this study, we were looking to see what would the ideal number be to take part. And also there was a criteria that prisoners had to fit into in order to take part in the study. It wasn't just an open-ended study that we were going to do. We were trying to highlight how parenting supports can encourage prisoners to continue parenting. They do have that right. They are parents, regardless to what happened, regardless to what brings them into the prison setting. They have the right to be a parent, and that right should never be taken away from them, regardless to where they are. So we were kind of thinking along those lines. So what we did, I have to commend Prison Link worker Stacey here, because Stacey really put a lot of work. I may not have given it justice when I was speaking about how the reach out came about, but there was an awful lot of planning. There was an awful lot of going in and out to the prisons and trying to get a word around the prison that we're looking at doing this study. So Stacey would have picked key people in the prison to tell them about the study and then for them to pass on the message. So what came back to Stacey then was we had a lot of interest. In particular, I think there was something like 20, and I know if I get my figures wrong, it is backed up in the report. There was something like 20 prisoners that expressed a wish to be on it. But again, the logistics in prison, some people get moved from Landon to Landon, they can get moved from prison to prison, they can get moved from mainstream into progression unit, back from progression into mainstream, and then you have the rehabilitative Landons. So, you know, what might work today might not be in place next week. So you have to take that into account as well. So there was 20 participants that did express an interest. 10 prisoners, as far as I know and can remember, bear in mind the study was done in 2019, 10 prisoners were selected to take part in the study. And then again, with the logistics, there was a time lapse from when that was chosen to when the study actually happened and when we got into the prison to do the program. So at that stage then, I think it was 7 that we had. And then it commenced with the 7. And if I'm correct, I think during that, I think one prisoner got moved to another prison. And then I think another prisoner went into the rehabilitative Landon, which meant he couldn't come back into the progression unit. So we did extremely well to end up with the 5 that was consistent right through the whole program. And the same happened with mentors. We had a couple of mentors lined up to be trained. We decided it'd be a good idea, bearing in mind, program is about working within the prison system. We don't work independently. We like to see our work as supporting to probation service, and we support the Irish Prison Service. So we complement each other. We don't overlap, we complement each other. So what we decided was we would open up the mentoring program to workers within the community setting. We'd open it up to the prison staff, including probation staff and the chaplain. So we did extremely well. We managed to train up a good couple of mentors, teething problems along the way, just like there was with the mentees. But we ended up with, I think it was 5 to 6 mentors fully trained in the program. So I suppose going forward, and cost basis as well, we have done a cost analysis of what it may cost. Personally, I would like Fusion to continue the relationship with Arteries. I would like to see Arteries come back and deliver another couple of programs. I think if we got a funding to run even 2 more groups, 2 different prisons. I love the idea of what Sean said, bring it into the women's prison, male prison and a women's prison. I think that'd be excellent. So ideally what I'd like to do is continue that relationship, get Arteries back, train up more mentors. And then as this program takes off, mentors don't need to be retrained. Once a mentor, you're going to be always a mentor. So your costing will come down. And then eventually I would love a group of mentors trained in all the prisons. And that way then you'd be looking at training long-term prisoners. And then they too, while they might start as a mentee, they can promote themselves up to a mentor. And then that will keep your cost factors down. So that's where I would see it going.
Thanks, Kathy. We have a few other just additional questions. And just to say, people, because we're going to wrap at 12:30, so we've 15 minutes, and I know Stacey wants to come in at the end just to say a few things. So basically we've 10 minutes for these next few questions max. So first of all, a question from Claire Hurley, and I think this would be very much for I suppose Stacey. How did you select who was eligible to get involved in the program? Was the length of sentence or the area involved? So just hold with that question, because we've 2 others I want to go to. And they were another one from Shauna Corskadden. From doing the study, did you find that it was a common thing that families where parents were imprisoned, that children ended up in the likes of Oberstown and then into the prison system itself? Now, I don't know whether the sample in itself would be sufficient to draw any conclusions on that. But anyway, that was that piece about the cycle, I suppose the intergenerational cycle of offending. And then another question then from James Thomas Bowes. Thanks, James. You made a couple of contributions to the chat, but again, the question is should, given that there's a certain discretion on governors as to whether they engage with programs like this or not, should we be looking to IPS corporate, the Irish Prison Service, to engage so that it's across all of the prison estate rather than just on a prison by prison basis? And just, sorry, there was just one other final question. So there's 4 from Aisling Murphy, and Aisling's question has a number of different parts to it. So Aisling asks, am I right in thinking the content was developed from interviews with prisoners? How many prisoners were interviewed? And I think Kathy's talked about that. It was around 20, and how are they selected, which comes back to another question that was asked. And also given the numbers are very small in the pilot, I suppose there are issues then about generalizing from that to a wider sample. So could we maybe, Stacey, again, would you maybe come in on those, please?
Yeah, so we took referrals from chaplains, ISM officers, addiction counsellors within the prison, and we interviewed everyone that applied, but they needed to have regular contact with their children through phone and through a visit, and they needed to have another person on the outside. So that could have been a partner, an ex-partner, or one of the participants, for example, have had their mother being their point person on the outside. They had to have someone on the outside that was willing to engage in the program as well, to allow that mentoring piece. There was exclusionary criteria, and that's where I'm going to pass over to Sean, because he has a better memory than I do, and he'll be able to answer that.
Yep. There were inclusionary criteria. We had to ensure that the the relationship between the prisoner and the partner outside was stable and safe and secure, and because the partners were going to play a fundamental part in the development of the relationship that was protected towards the child. So any suggestion of any coercive behaviours on the part of the prisoner, they were immediately excluded from the programme itself. I just wanted to touch on another thing that was mentioned earlier on about the intergenerational effect. Obviously, these kids, the kids of the people who took part in the programme were quite young, but there was a bidirectional effect. Several of the people who first put themselves forward for the programme and who actually participated had family members who were in jail, including parents. And so they were very much aware of the potential for that cycle to continue. And that was the difficulty when they found, when the partner began to explain to them that perhaps their child was edging towards dysregulation in terms of their behavior or hanging around with a negative kind of peer group. So I think that was the impetus of what drove many of the people to take part in the program. In fact, on my first visit to the prison, I was actually stopped by a prisoner on the outside on the wall, and he asked me about, you know, is there anything he can do to protect his child from following his footsteps? And I was really shocked that he was so open about that process. In terms of it's a small study, can you then extrapolate out to a more generalized effect? Actually, you can, because our findings were entirely consistent with the use of this type of family communication model. It's not entirely new. It's been tried and tested in other areas. And I think what makes it unique is that this was very much tailored, not by prisoner inputs, but by recognizing deficits in prisoners in terms of family communication, which we then built around. So yeah, I think we can very definitely extrapolate out based upon other research using a similar communication model. And the bidirectional effect, we're hoping, obviously, we will break that. We will break that intergenerational effect. But obviously, there are things that we can control and there are things that we can't.
Thanks, Sean. Kathy, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I suppose just to say that the important message would be, once a person goes to prison, as Sean said earlier, they may have committed a crime. Their sentence is their punishment, and that's where it needs to stop. What happens in prison can be very rehabilitative. Prisoners can change. They don't lose their love for their family don't lose their love for them. They're entitled to have a life, whether that's inside or whether that's outside. And I think as a wider community, we can support that process. And always to remember, the child is at the heart of that process, and the child doesn't need to be punished for what the parent may have done. And if we want to break the cycle, we need to be a little bit more, I suppose, compassionate about parenting from within the prison system, and given the confidence, given the support for that to continue. And then hopefully, once the person is released, they can pick up the pieces from where they left off. The family can move on, and more importantly, the child can continue to have a childhood without feeling they need to go under the radar because of embarrassment of where the parent is. So I suppose the study speaks for itself. It is a small study. We're very aware it's a small study, but it had to be small to make sure it was able to finish. And I think hopefully this will be the beginning of something bigger.
I know there were some additional questions. Stacey, have you copied or saved just the chat and the Q&A, and that you can follow up afterwards? So just to say that there will be follow-up with sort of things that weren't sort of answered, or indeed if people themselves on the Zoom, if any follow-up things, the thing to do is get in touch with Stacey, as the sort of the person, the key person on this within Fusion CPL, and look, Stacey can sort of deal with that. Before going to Stacey, because if people don't mind, I'm going to stop the questions there, because I think we've sort of, well, I was going to say agreed, but I've suggested a way in which we can manage any further things that we haven't covered and any other additional things. I do want to acknowledge there are a number of public reps on the thing. And the reason I want to acknowledge them is to come back to the point of mainstreaming. So I do want to acknowledge that we do have, just looking through the list there, 4 public reps on the thing: Patrick Costello, Angus O'Snuddig, Dahi Doolan, and Mary Siri Carney. And look, all of you have means through which you can raise this thing. And in particular, I know Patrick is obviously a member of the Justice Committee as well. I would hope that there might be an opportunity, for example, to share this experience, for instance, with members of the Justice Committee. I think that could be a good opportunity. And also, I think the hopefully ensure that the funding to mainstream it, or indeed to develop the program, is provided, because Kathy has talked about that. So anything that the public reps can do on that would be really helpful, and through the good offices, for instance, of the Justice Committee, and as I mentioned, Patrick is on that. But as I said, to acknowledge and thank those public reps for coming along, for their support. And it's something that we need your support after this so that the work can continue. So anyway, enough of me. Stacey, over to you. I know you just want to wrap it up at this stage, and on my behalf, before Stacey does that, to acknowledge and thank everybody for being involved in coming along, and I hope you got something out of it. Stacey, over to you.
Okay, so I just am left with the nice part. I get to thank everyone. So there was a huge amount of people that supported us and helped us through this pilot. And I wish I had the time to go through everyone individually. So we've just picked out some key people that we'd like to thank. So the Board of Management of Fusion and the Ballyfermot Local Drug and Alcohol Task Force, who believed in the programme when it was a seed of an idea and supported us in allowing it to grow to what it is and hopefully what it can be. To Archways and the Blue Skies Initiative for their work at all stages of the programme, especially in the design of the participant manuals. To Mountjoy Progression Unit staff who went out of their way to facilitate us and who supported the implementation of the programme at every step. To the mentors, Ruth, Alan, Paul and Jim, who gave 100% and who have become key advocates of the programme. To all the participants and their families for their support, trust and unwavering enthusiasm throughout the programme. I see that some of them have logged on today, and I know that there's some of the prisoners that are able to watch. So thank you so much. To Pat, the best MC, and to Niall, there would be no launch today if it wasn't for you guys, so thank you. And to our current funders for allowing us the time and space to see this through. And just very lastly, a recording of the launch and a PDF of the report will be made available on our website and social media from Friday. If you would like a hard copy of the report or have any further queries or questions, as Pat said, if you can just email me, and then I've just left our social media handles as well. Thank you.
And also too, as well, I should say that Fusion is on Twitter as well. But anyway, there we go. I'm going to be linking your Twitter handle in on it later on anyway, because I took some screenshots which I'm going to tweet later on in the day. Okay. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well done, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.